This is the final PowerPoint looking at skill acquisition principles. In particular, we look at some coaching approaches, so a direct or traditional based approach and also a constraints based approach. We also look at some other factors that can impact learning and skill performance. They're called socio-cultural factors. Again, we must refer to the study design in all that we cover. The textbooks are an interpretation of the study design, so too are my PowerPoints. So the key knowledge and key skills that link directly here are there for you to see. I've bolded, I suppose, the action verbs for what you should be able to do with the content that's also got some bold terms there as well. So pay attention to this. This is where all the questions for your Saxon exams must come from. Two key essential questions here. What are the major approaches to coaching? They can kind of be seen as a continuum, if you like, a traditional approach, a more modern approach. And then what are and how can socio-cultural factors impact on performance? Guiding questions are again provided to help you structure some responses and notes from the particular PowerPoint, always supported by the text and any other web links that make sense. So you're encouraged to write these down, annotate as you would per an exam, and then to flesh out the details here and where you come up with blanks or problems or confusions. That's when you start the conversation with fellow students and myself. In terms of setting up a coaching scenario, there's really two main schools of thought or two main branches. And the first is the traditional or the direct approach, which is kind of the military style, that one size fits all. The teacher or the coach is the knowledge content expert and delivers what he thinks or she thinks that group or class needs. So it's very much do as I do, very much drill based, very much key features of skills for the athletes to follow through, not so much game time. There is a time and a place for it, especially in the early years and for developing fundamental movement skills. And from time to time, elite players will come back into aspects of this. The flip side or the counterpoint to the traditional or direct model is the constraints-based approach. So the constraint just simply means something that you can manipulate or modify. There's a whole range of things you can do, whether it's the physical environment or whether it's the task, but how you shape and change what's required in a particular training or practice activity. The fancy bullet point there that says ecological or dynamic systems just recognises that you have a lot of variables at your disposal that you can manage. This is a diagram from one of the textbooks just showing you the level of the three categories of constraints, if you like. And I think most questions we'll be look at the task constraints, so the nature of the activity. So if you're thinking about soccer, for example, the ball size, the pitch size, the team size, the rules that you play by, the aim of the game are all task constraints. If you play indoors or outdoors, that's an example of an environmental constraint. If it's especially windy or especially muddy, that's an environmental constraint. In terms of individual constraints, essentially they are what you bring to the party. So your age, your gender, your motivation, your self-efficacy, all those kinds of things. This diagram splits into structural and functional. So structural would be something to do with your body type, whereas functional is something to do with what you can do. So structural might be that you are a 6 foot tall grade 4-year-old student. Functional might be that you've got a low level of strength or coordination. But ultimately there are things that you have that are unique to you that the coach, I suppose, may try to bypass or work with by managing the other constraints. At the top of the triangle or at the top of the pyramid is the individual. So it just recognises that for whatever training environment or learning environment you are setting up, you are dealing with individuals who are all unique. And there's things there like body structure, fitness, their emotional state, perceptual skills. They all bring their own backstory and their own experiences to whatever you're doing, and you need to be mindful of that. Thirdly is the task-related constraints, and I think there's a lot more leeway here for the teacher or the coach to make some more modifications to manipulate the training environment. And it's to do with what you're actually asking the athlete to do. So if it's a 2 versus 2 basketball game, we've instantly changed the team size. Are we using a standard size ball? Are we dropping the size of the ball to recognise these people have smaller hands because they're younger people? How big is the playing space? Is it going to be a whole half of the court, or is it just going to be inside the 3-point line? The demands of the game, all those kinds of things can be managed so that we get a better learning environment and maximise learning outcomes. So we consider the individual first, if you like, although the order doesn't really matter. It is cyclical in all the diagrams. If we start with recognising the individual, which is a good way to go, we then recognise the conditions we're putting them in, so the physical environment. And that will have an impact on what you do and how learning progresses. I would suggest that if you were practicing netball on this particular court, you wouldn't be that committed to working too hard to get the ball because it looks particularly slippery and pretty unforgiving if you were to fall over on it. So just being mindful of weather conditions, noise levels, things like light and the quality of the surface will all have an impact on what you can get out of the performer in your particular practice or learning environment. Now, in terms of what are the socio-cultural influences, I think there are more than those bullet points, but these are the bullet points that VCAR suggests. So please try and find a way to remember and make sense of them. It's not quite so broad as aspects of the socio-ecological model you did in Unit 2. So try and narrow it down to these: family, peers, community, gender, socioeconomic status, cultural beliefs and traditions, and make sure that you are specific in your application of these influences to your particular scenario. So it might be a positive or a negative influence. But for example, family might support a child's performance in cricket by taking them to cricket training. Socioeconomic status might allow them to buy their kit, so their pads, their bats, their helmets, okay, to promote or to encourage them playing cricket. Or flip it on its head: a lack of transport from family, a lack of money, socioeconomic status might limit their participation in that particular sport. This is a nice little mind map to just show where all the pieces link together. So at the middle in red, we've got instruction and coaching. So as a coach or as a teacher, these are the things you need to be mindful of. Starting at the top with the broader range of influences on that particular person or group of people you are trying to teach. So that's the socio-cultural influences on that particular person. That should also include the individual, which isn't actually well represented in this diagram. So the individual constraints that they bring to the actual training session or the school or their understanding of the particular game. Bottom left, we look at your options in terms of, do we go for a traditional, direct, explicit teaching, coaching model to help this person learn this skill, or do we go to a constraints-based approach, which could be broken down to labeling game sense or teaching games for understanding. And then I guess over all of that is this idea of, where is this person in this stage of learning, and I need to modify what I'm doing in light of it. Are they cognitive, associative, or autonomous? So it's a pretty good mind map. I would add individual differences top left. And here's a compare the pair for you. It's taken out of one of the other textbooks. You can see how it's set up as opposites. So coach oriented is direct. So that means the coach is kind of master and running the show, as opposed to indirect, where it's learner oriented, and the coach is flexible enough to adapt the tasks and the progressions based on what the learners are showing, etc., etc. That's a good way, I think, to see them as opposites, but that they can work hand in hand at different stages of learning for different tasks, depending on what you're asking the player or athlete to do. Lastly, stages of learning runs through all that we've talked about for skill learning, and you need to be mindful of what you would do to open and close a skill, or to choose massed versus distributed practice, or to do blocked versus random practice, or the type of feedback you would give, knowledge of results versus knowledge of performance, and equally with this final slideshow, in terms of how you structure your coaching approach, whether it's traditional direct or constraints based, and then what constraints you actually manage. So all of that has to be done with the understanding of what's best for a person in this stage of learning.